thank you, Paul, for giving the first few slides of my presentation. So I'll be able to skip a few things here. I agree with many of the things you say, but I'm going to put some bémols on little accents on certain things, and a couple I'm not completely aligned with. So what I want to do is, I have way too many slides, so I'm going to have to skip quite a few, but I want to make the argument that we have to distinguish very carefully between goods and services when we talk about deglobalization. And I would say that there's a reasonably good case that there's peak globalization in goods, but definitely not in services. And that's where I get the argument that the future of services, the future of trade or globalization is in services, in particular intermediate services. So let me get to that. So first, I'm going to convince you that the future of trade is not in goods, but that it is in services as a second point. Let me give you a couple of facts. This is you've already seen on Paul's, although this is slightly different. Paul, although it's not marked in his slide, but I think he's taking all world trade, goods and services, over world GDP. But if you separate world trade in goods over GDP, this peak in 2008 is even clearer. Now, there's more or less a plateau up until 93. Then you got this rapid expansion of offshoring, which led to naturally a rising trade to GDP ratio because goods crossed borders several times. And now it's kind of peaked after 2008. However, world trade in services has not peaked, not even close. So if you see from 75 to 93, it went from 6% of world commerce. So this is services over goods and services. And from 93 to 2008, it went up to 12%. And since 2008, it's gone up to another 14%. So there's no evidence at all of deglobalization in services. And in fact, now, if you look at the share, it's actually quite large, although obviously trade in goods still dominates, but services is coming up fast. The next, let me see if I can get the next slide there. Okay. So this kind of shows you the cumulative growth of, and this, by the way, is from a paper I wrote for Sintra just in June. It's now an NBR working paper. So what I did is I put the goods trade, world goods trade to 100 in 1990, and other commercial services, which is basically digitally traded services, to 100 in 1990. And you can see that the services has increased by 11 times, goods only 5 times. So this is in nominal levels, not divided by GDP, but you can see services is soaring and has had none of this kind of impact of protection or whatever it was. So now what I want to do is focus on this goods peak, and Paul made a number of these points. So this peak in 2008 is false because if you take the 4 largest traders, EU, China, Japan, and the US, China peaked before, US and Japan peaked afterwards, and the EU hasn't really peaked. But it's very clear that the trade to GDP share is not rising like it was before. So that's a powerful message. So it's, even if it hasn't peaked, there's something has changed. And Paul was pointing out to the end of this offshoring expansion phase, which I agree with very much, although I would have called this globalization second unbundling. Okay, but China plays a big role in this. And I would argue that China is not unusual. It's actually becoming a normal mega economy. If you look at the left chart there, you'll see China's imports and exports of goods as a percent of GDP peaked in 2006, and now is converging to the level of other mega economies like Japan and the United States. India is doing the same thing. If you look at the right chart, though, you'll see it's a little bit different in that China is engaging in global value chains. On the selling side, it's still rising, but on the buying side, it's going down. So its engagement is becoming asymmetric, and China is the largest single trader in the country, in the world. So as a country, so it's really, really important. Okay, now what I want to do is break down this global trade peak that we saw, and Paul showed us, the trade in goods over world GDP, into manufacturers, mining and fuels, and agriculture. And if you do that, what you'll see is 60% of the drop is from mining and fuels, most of it driven by the commodity super cycle. So obviously this is before the most recent peak, the spike we've seen in prices. But a lot of what we're looking at was actually all about mining and fuels, which I don't think is playing into the stories of deglobalization and end of neoliberalism and all that sort of stuff. Now, 40% is manufactured goods, and I want to look at that a little bit. So first of all, 2 points. Globalization's last phase, this offshoring expansion phase, did plateau. In other words, we got the low-hanging fruit out of that, so it stopped expanding. And of course, trade in goods is expanding, just not as fast as GDP. The second is I'd argue that supply chains are unwinding domestically and internationally. And let me show you a couple of facts here. So first of all, if you look at the share of world manufacturing for the G7 and the I6 are the emerging countries who've seen their world share of manufacturing rise by more than 0.5% since 1990. That's China, India, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brazil. A lot of that's just domestic sales rather than export sales. Now, what you'll see is that the G7 was pretty stable and high until about 1999, and then it fell and then it stabilized. And that's almost exactly matched by the rise of the I6, which has also rose and now kind of stabilized. The rest of the world didn't do much at all. Now, what I want to do is look at supply chains unwinding by looking at the world manufacturing value added as a percent of gross production. Now, what this is, gross production includes intermediate sales of firms to firms and final sales. So the ratio of value added, which is essentially final goods, over gross production, is an inverse measure of how complicated and long global supply chains are. As you can see, the global supply chains have been becoming longer up, so starting from, this is the TIVA data, it goes from 95 to 2018. You can see that that ratio was falling, therefore global value chains were increasing, and then it increased much more steeply. But since 2013, it's gone the other way. In other words, the share of intermediate trade over total production has fallen, not suggesting it. The only way that can happen is if supply chains get shorter or less complicated. Okay, so I'm going to skip the trade thing on this as well. Now, the argument I want to make quickly is that manufactured goods are becoming non-traded and jobless. And this is a technology thing that Paul didn't track on. It comes from Bloomberg and a bunch, Nick Bloom and a bunch of other guys, Van Reenen, who distinguish between communication technology and information technology. And information technology is essentially agglomerating a whole bunch of tasks into a machine, which therefore lowers the labor cost share. Now, what I'd argue is the only way to get a comparative advantage in manufacturing is to have it based on something that's non-traded. Because if whatever the input is traded, you can't derive a relative cost advantage, which is what comparative advantage is. And basically that means labor. So most of the trade is driven by differences in labor cost of different types of labor, of course, all around the world. But as automation reduces the labor cost share in manufacturing, it will make manufactured goods non-traded. In essence, that's essentially what's going on in China in an accelerated way, where China is trading less with the world because it's making all the stuff locally. And if you can do it like this, you can see this is the cost share. I have a little model in one of the papers I published, but essentially this A curve tilts and more of the goods are non-traded. So I don't have time to go through that whole thing, but the slides are there so you can look at it. Now what I want to do is focus on services. The argument is that the future of trade is in intermediate services, and this is written up at length in a paper I just did for the ECB in June this year. That should be 2021 too. Okay, so here is what I showed you before. Other commercial services all over, all goods and services. By 2020, that's about 20%. So it's only a fifth, but it's growing very rapidly. So just on the extrapolation, the future of trade is services because goods has stagnated or is falling and services have not. By the way, it's growing 2 or 3 times faster than goods. So the transition is not going to take forever. Now I want to make an argument. First of all, barriers to services are much higher than barriers to goods, often 1,000 times higher. Most barriers to trade in intermediate goods are technologically linked, not policy linked. Trade in final services is incredibly protected. You can look it up with the OECD's Trade Service Restrictiveness Index. But that's something like a lawyer giving advice to a client. But all this service tasks involved in getting that advice are not regulated. Having the contracts proofread, anybody basically can do that because we rely on the lawyer to do the quality control, not regulation. So intermediate trade is not regulated. It's only inhibited by things like the cost of remote work. Third, digitech is lowering the cost to intermediate services at an explosive pace, and COVID accelerated that by making it easy for people to do service jobs remotely and making all the adjustments necessary. Fourth, is there a huge demand in rich countries for intermediate trade services, and there's a huge capacity in emerging markets. So therefore, I think intermediate service trade will grow much faster than goods trade for the foreseeable future. Now, what do I mean by intermediate trade services? This is all the service tasks in the service sector, manufacturing sector, and private sector that are not sold directly to customers. For example, bookkeeping, forensics, accountants, and all that. But let me show you a couple of astounding facts. Intermediate, this is again from the TIVA data set, intermediate imports is more important in services than it is in manufacturing. So the share of trade in business services that's intermediates is much higher than it is in manufacturing. The other one is service intermediates are 3 times more important than manufacturing intermediates in the overall economy, because every sector uses intermediate services. This is again from the TIVA database. The service sector uses 32% intermediate inputs, manufacturing 24%. So for the total, it's about 30%. But for manufacturing, it's only really manufactured sector, which is quite small in most rich countries, is only using 25%. So the total economy is only 11%. So there's an enormous demand for intermediate services, and the price differences. I wrote a paper about prices of services in Colombia versus the US. It's often 15 times cheaper in developing countries than in rich countries for bookkeeping, accountants, lawyers, things like that. Just keep in mind that $5 an hour is a middle-class living in most countries. That's $10,000 a year, which is middle class in most countries. So lots of professionals earn less than $5 an hour. Okay, so this is every sector. Now, let me just give them key takeaways. First of all, trade in intermediate services is something we're all going to have to learn about. And there's 2 things to distinguish there. One, we need to separate goods and services very clearly, because going forward, the trends of digital technology, protection, and all that are having very different effects on them. The second is we have to distinguish between intermediate services, which are unprotected, and by and large unregulated, and final services, which are heavily regulated. But because of digital technology, the service supply chain has fragmented and allowed trade in the intermediate services when it wasn't before. Second, automation is making manufacturing jobless and thus non-traded. Emerging markets miracle will continue and spread geographically because it's going to be emerging markets exporting this. Think India, not China. And service-led development will replace industry-led development for many, many countries. So those are some wild conjectures that I wanted to end with simply to spark the discussion. And I'll stop right there. Thank you for your attention.